My husband made $1 million a year. I made a few thousand a month standing over a stove. That was the math he liked to repeat whenever we argued. He built systems. I built sauces. He scaled platforms. I plated food. According to Joseph, income was the scoreboard of adulthood. And he was winning. The night I followed my own car, I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for confirmation. The notification came through the Tesla app at 7:42 in the evening. Unscheduled stop. The car had been parked for 32 minutes at a boutique hotel in downtown Scottsdale. Joseph had told me he was meeting investors. He said they liked quiet places. He said it would be late. I watched the blue dot on the screen and felt something colder than jealousy. Precision. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I grabbed my keys and drove. The parking lot was softly lit. The kind of expensive dimness that makes everything look intentional. I spotted the Tesla immediately. It was easy to recognize when your name was on the title. Joseph was leaning against the driver's side door. His tie loosened. His posture relaxed. Amanda stood between him and the hood. 32 years old. Data analyst at his company. Sharp blazer. Glossy hair. She laughed at something he said. And then he kissed her like there was no one left in the world who could interrupt him. I stepped closer. That's when the rear passenger door opened. His mother stepped out. She smoothed her cardigan as if she'd just exited a theater. Not the back seat of my car. "Emily," she said, her voice low and controlled. "This is awkward." In that moment, I understood something important. This wasn't just an affair. It was a performance. And I was meant to watch. Joseph saw me a second later. He didn't look ashamed. He looked irritated, as if I had shown up early to something he had already decided I was no longer invited to. "Emily," he said, pushing off the car. We were going to talk. Amanda stepped back, suddenly quiet, though not embarrassed. She looked at me like I was a scheduling conflict. I didn't scream. I didn't slap him. I didn't cry. I stood there in my chef's jacket, the scent of garlic and thyme still clinging to my sleeves, and looked at the three of them, my husband, his colleague, and the woman who had never thought I was good enough for her son. 7 years of marriage. 8 if you counted the year we were engaged and broke and dreaming. Joseph made close to $1 million a year now. Stock options. Performance bonuses. A startup that had grown faster than any of us expected. He liked to remind me that he was carrying the weight of our future. "You cook," he once said at a dinner party, smiling too tightly. I build infrastructure. The guests had laughed. I had smiled. That night in the parking lot, the infrastructure was leaning against a car registered solely in my name. The Tesla Model X had been my grandmother's final gift to me. She left me an inheritance structured carefully through a trust. When I bought the car, I titled it in my name only. Joseph never objected. He said optics mattered when he met clients. And the car helped. Now he was using those optics to impress someone else. "Are you done?" I asked calmly. Joseph exhaled like I was exhausting him. "We need to discuss this at home." Amanda avoided my eyes. His mother folded her arms. "You don't have to make a scene," she added gently, as if I were the unstable variable. I almost laughed. "I'm not," I said. Joseph studied my face, waiting for something. Anger. Tears. A plea. He had always believed that emotional reaction meant leverage. If I broke, he could manage me. If I shouted, he could dismiss me. But I felt something else entirely. Clarity. "Drive yourself home," I said to him. "You'll need the practice." For the first time, his composure flickered. We left separately. I drove behind him for a moment before taking another exit. I didn't need to follow the car anymore. I knew where everything was headed. The house was quiet when I got back. Stainless steel counters. Open shelving. The kitchen where I had tested menu concepts at midnight while Joseph worked on code in the living room. When he walked in 30 minutes later, he didn't look at me right away. He loosened his cufflinks and set them down carefully. "We can't keep pretending," he said. "We're not aligned anymore." There it was. Not an apology. Not remorse. Alignment. He explained it like a quarterly review. We had grown apart. We wanted different things. He needed someone who understood his world. Someone on your level, I asked. He didn't deny it. The numbers hovered between us like a scoreboard. His salary, my restaurant's modest profit margins, his bonuses, my 12-hour shifts. He believed money translated directly into authority. You deserve someone who fits you better, he added, as if he were doing me a favor. I nodded once. What do you want? Joseph. A clean divorce, he said. No drama. We'll keep it simple. He said simple the way executives say scalable. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something else. He thought he was leaving from a position of power. He thought the income gap meant control. He thought I would panic. What he didn't know was that I had already started organizing documents months ago, back when his late nights stopped making sense, and his tone shifted from partnership to superiority. He thought tonight was the beginning of the end. For me, it was the confirmation of a strategy. That was the night my husband believed he was stepping into freedom. He didn't realize he had just stepped into my territory. We drove home in silence. But the silence wasn't shared. Joseph walked into the house like he owned the air inside it. He set his phone on the kitchen island and poured himself a glass of sparkling water, the way he always did after a productive meeting. I stood by the sink, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the window, chef's jacket wrinkled, hair pulled back too tightly, eyes steadier than I expected. He didn't apologize. Not once. We need to file, he said, finally turning toward me. There's no point dragging this out. File. As if our marriage were a document already archived. You and Amanda, I asked. He exhaled sharply. This isn't about her. It always amused me when men said that. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. We've been misaligned for a while. I've outgrown this dynamic. Outgrown. Like I was a starter apartment. I need someone who understands my world, he continued. The pressure. The scale. The expectations. And I don't? I asked. You cook? He said quietly. I build systems. There it was again. The hierarchy. His $1 million salary hovering in the air like proof of superiority. My few thousand a month reduced to a hobby in his narrative. I already spoke to an attorney, he added. That made me look at him. I wanted to make this easy for you, he said, softening his voice as if kindness were a strategy. No court battles. No public mess. We'll handle it privately. He walked to his office and returned with a thin folder. Inside were printed draft terms, clean. Organized. Efficient. A lump sum settlement. $400,000. In exchange, I would waive any claim to his startup equity, future bonuses, and executive compensation packages. No contest. No dispute. He slid it toward me like a tip after a meal. That's generous, he said. It avoids unnecessary conflict. Generous? I almost smiled. You think this is conflict? I asked. I think this is reality, he replied. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from his mother. Don't embarrass yourself. I locked the screen without responding. Joseph noticed. She's just worried. About what? I asked. Her son's reputation. He hesitated. That was the first crack. This doesn't need to become a spectacle, he said. The company's in the middle of a funding phase. Investors don't like instability. So that was it. Not heartbreak. Not betrayal. Instability. You're asking me not to destabilize your valuation, I said. I'm asking you to be rational. I picked up the settlement papers and flipped through them slowly. The language was confident, assumptive, structured around the idea that I would want out quickly and quietly. You think I'm going to fight you for revenge? I said. He gave a tight shrug. I don't know what you're going to do. I looked at him for a long moment. I'm not going to scream, I said. If that's what you're waiting for. His jaw tightened. He had been waiting for it. Later that night, he packed a small suitcase. Not hurried. Not ashamed. Efficient. He moved like a man checking out of a hotel room he'd already decided wasn't 5-star enough. At the door, he paused. "We should limit contact from now on," he said. "Until this is finalized. Limit contact." I nodded once. An hour after he left, my phone lit up with a message from him. "Let's not contact each other from now on. It'll make this cleaner." Cleaner. I stared at the text for a few seconds, then typed a single word. "Okay." I pressed send. It wasn't surrender. It was confirmation. Joseph believed silence meant weakness. He believed emotional distance equaled advantage. He believed that because he earned more, he dictated outcomes. He didn't know that for the past several months. I had been scanning bank statements more carefully. He didn't know I had asked questions about certain transfers. He didn't know I had pulled copies of property deeds and trust documents. He didn't know I had never signed anything without reading every page. He thought tonight was the beginning of my panic. Instead, I opened my laptop. The folder was labeled Foundation. Not dramatic. Not suspicious. Just organized. Inside were scanned copies of vehicle titles, trust agreements, purchase receipts, and something else he had long forgotten. 3 years ago, when he left his stable engineering job to join the startup, he came to me with spreadsheets and projections. He said we needed runway capital. He said it was temporary. He said it was ours. I remembered the way he looked then, hopeful, dependent, ambitious but not yet arrogant. I had liquidated part of my inheritance portfolio to help him, structured it carefully, through a limited liability company created under my maiden name. He had skimmed the documents before signing. I had not. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Joseph. "We'll coordinate through attorneys from here." Of course we would. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. He thought he had already won because he was the higher earner, because he had the louder title, because he assumed I would negotiate from emotion instead of structure. He assumed I didn't understand valuation. He assumed I didn't understand ownership. He assumed wrong. It was past midnight when I picked up my phone again. I didn't scroll through our old photos. I didn't reread old messages. I didn't cry. I opened my contacts and selected one name. Michael. I typed 4 words. "It's time. Call me." Then I set the phone down and turned off the kitchen lights. Joseph had asked for no contact. What he didn't realize was that the next communication wouldn't come from me. It would come on legal letterhead. Michael replied in less than 3 minutes. I had expected a voicemail in the morning, maybe a polite suggestion to schedule a meeting. Instead, my phone lit up almost instantly. "I've been expecting your call," he wrote. There was something about that sentence that steadied me. We met at his office the next morning before my restaurant opened. Downtown Phoenix was already warming under the sun. Glass buildings reflecting light like polished knives. I arrived in my chef's jacket, hair tied back. No makeup, no attempt at looking like anything other than myself. Michael was 39, precise, and never wasted words. He didn't look surprised when I sat across from him. "I assume this is about the hotel," he said. I blinked once. "You assume correctly." He slid a thick folder across the desk. My maiden name was printed neatly on the tab. "I pulled everything you asked me to prepare last year," he said. "Just in case." Last year? That was when Joseph's tone started shifting. When his late nights multiplied and his compliments disappeared. I hadn't accused him of anything then. I had just organized. Michael opened the folder. "Let's start simple," he said. He pulled out the vehicle title. Tesla Model X, registered owner, Emily Carter. No joint lien, no co-title, he said. He cannot claim ownership. I felt a quiet flicker of something, not triumph, just confirmation. Next came the property deed for our house. Purchased using funds transferred from your grandmother's estate trust. Michael continued. The title was placed in your name before marriage and never amended. Joseph had once suggested refinancing jointly for convenience. I had declined. He can argue community contribution if marital income was used for maintenance, Michael added. But primary ownership is documented. Then he pulled out something thicker. Formation documents for an LLC under my maiden name. 3 years ago, I remembered the day Joseph had come to me with excitement in his voice and projections on his laptop. He had wanted to leave his corporate job and join a startup building AI logistics systems. He said it was risky but transformative. He said it was our future. We needed capital. I had liquidated a portion of my inheritance portfolio and structured the investment through my own LLC, not as a loan. As equity. Michael turned the page. 15% preferred equity, he said calmly. Not common shares? Preferred. Joseph had skimmed that word. I had not. There's more, Michael said. He pointed to a clause buried several pages deep. In the event of material reputational harm or executive misconduct, preferred shareholders may accelerate voting rights and initiate forced buyback procedures at fair market value. I stared at the paragraph. Joseph had signed it. He trusted me then. He trusted that I wouldn't read what he didn't read. What's the current valuation? I asked. Michael pulled up a recent industry report. After the last funding round, estimated company valuation is north of 100 million, he said. Your 15% is significant. My heartbeat didn't spike. It slowed. Joseph had been telling me for months that I didn't understand scale. I understood structure. There's something else, Michael added. He turned his monitor toward me. An internal valuation memo from 6 months ago. The financial model understated early capital injections, framing later funding rounds as primary drivers of growth. The memo was signed off by Amanda. She's the data analyst, Michael asked. Yes. He nodded slightly. There's no formal amendment to your equity position. On paper, you remain fully protected. But this discrepancy is interesting. Interesting was his word for dangerous. If we initiate a buyback trigger, he continued, he would have 48 hours to purchase your shares at fair market value. And if he can't, I asked, you may transfer to an external buyer. That would introduce new voting dynamics. Joseph hated loss of control more than he feared embarrassment. If we time this before their next funding phase, Michael said carefully, the board will pay attention. I leaned back in the chair. Joseph thought this was about feelings. About humiliation in a parking lot. This was about documentation. Will it look vindictive? I asked. Michael didn't hesitate. No, it will look contractual. He printed a draft notice. As he worked, my phone buzzed repeatedly on the desk. Joseph's name lit up the screen again and again. I didn't answer. He thought silence meant weakness. He didn't realize silence was leverage. Before we file, Michael said, glancing up, is there anything else I should know? I hesitated for a moment. There's a folder, I said slowly. Emails. Expense summaries. Travel reimbursements. Connected to the hotel? He asked. Yes. His expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind his eyes. Forward them to me, he said. We'll review for potential fiduciary exposure. Fiduciary. Joseph loved that word when he used it to describe responsibility to investors. I wondered how he'd feel hearing it applied to himself. Michael slid the formal notice toward me. If you authorize this, he said, the next communication your husband receives will not be emotional. It will be legal. I signed. The pen moved steadily in my hand. No tremor. No hesitation. Joseph had asked for no contact. He was about to receive exactly that. When I stepped back out into the Arizona heat, the city felt different. Not because my marriage was ending, but because the power imbalance Joseph had leaned on so heavily had just been recalculated. He believed his salary defined our hierarchy. He believed his title defined authority. He believed the car he drove defined image. What he didn't understand was this. He built systems, and I owned the structure underneath them. The certified notice would be delivered to his office by morning. For the first time since that parking lot, I almost felt something close to anticipation. Not revenge. Correction. And Joseph had no idea it was coming. The certified notice was delivered at 9:12 in the morning. Michael forwarded me the confirmation receipt before I had even finished prepping the lunch menu. I wiped my hands on a towel, stepped into my office, and read the subject line. Notice of equity buyback initiation. Joseph had 48 hours. I imagined him opening the envelope at his glass-walled office, scanning the legal language, realizing that this wasn't a bluff, not a threat, not an emotional reaction, a trigger. 3 years earlier, when Joseph sat across from me at our kitchen table with spreadsheets glowing on his laptop, he had spoken about risk like it was romantic. "This is our shot," he had said. "I just need runway." He had already resigned from his previous job. The startup offered equity but little immediate salary. He needed capital to stabilize the transition. I remember the smell of coffee between us. The way he reached for my hand when he explained projected growth curves. "It's temporary," he promised. "Once we scale, we'll both benefit." I didn't hand him money blindly. I met with Michael. We structured the investment through my grandmother's estate trust. The funds were transferred into a limited liability company registered under my maiden name. In exchange, I received 15% preferred equity. Preferred meant priority. Preferred meant protection. And buried on page 11 was the clause Joseph skimmed past. In the event of material reputational harm or executive misconduct, preferred shareholders could accelerate voting rights and initiate buyback procedures at fair market value. He had signed it without hesitation. Back in the present, my phone vibrated nonstop. Joseph. I let it ring. Then a text. "What is this?" Another. "Are you serious right now?" I responded with nothing. He called again. This time I answered. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Exercising a contractual right," I said calmly. "You're destabilizing the company. I'm enforcing terms you signed." A pause. "You're overreacting," he said. "This is personal." "No," I replied. "It's structural." He exhaled sharply. "We can settle this without dragging the board into it." "You have 48 hours," I said. "You know the terms." I hung up before he could reply. Within the hour, Michael sent me another message. We received internal correspondence. Attached was an email thread from 6 months earlier. A revised valuation model circulated internally before the last funding round. The document understated early investor capital contributions, including mine, and highlighted later-stage performance metrics as primary growth drivers. The revision was approved by Amanda. I read through the comments carefully. One message from Joseph stood out. "Let's keep early capital dilution clean until funding closes." Clean. The word felt familiar. Joseph had always preferred clean narratives, clean exits, clean reputations. But the equity position had never been legally amended. No signed modification. No consent from my LLC on paper. My 15% remained intact. In perception, it had been minimized. Michael called me. "This discrepancy could qualify as misrepresentation," he said. "At minimum, it triggers review." "Would that activate the misconduct clause?" I asked. "If tied to reputational or fiduciary harm, potentially." By noon, Joseph showed up at the restaurant. He walked in without calling, scanning the dining room like he expected privacy to bend around him. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice controlled but tight. I stepped into the office with him and closed the door. "You're threatening liquidity," he said. "Do you have any idea what this does to investor confidence?" "Do you?" I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. "This doesn't have to escalate." "You escalated it in a parking lot," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "I made a mistake," he said. "But you're targeting my career." "No," I replied. "Your paperwork is..." He stared at me. "Trying to recalibrate. I can increase the settlement," he offered quickly. "Cash. Immediate transfer. So you do have liquidity?" I asked. His silence answered that. The truth was simple. To buy back my shares at current valuation. Joseph would need millions in available capital. Capital he did not have in liquid form. The startup was valuable on paper, not in his bank account. "You're making this about ego," he said finally. "No," I said. "I'm making it about terms." He lowered his voice. "Amanda had nothing to do with the structure. Her name is on the revision memo," I replied. For the first time, something like fear flickered in his eyes. "This could trigger compliance review," he muttered. "Yes," I said. We stood there in silence for a moment. The hum of the kitchen carried faintly through the door. "You don't understand the ripple effect," he said. "I understand ownership," I replied. After he left, Michael called again. "We can formally request internal audit review under preferred shareholder rights," he said, "especially given the valuation discrepancy and potential expense reclassification." "Expense reclassification?" I asked. "There are travel reimbursements we're reviewing. The hotel appears more than once. The boutique hotel. The same place I had stood in the parking lot watching my marriage end. If the audit confirms misuse of company funds," Michael continued, "the misconduct clause activates automatically." I leaned back in my chair. Joseph had believed that night was about humiliation. It was about documentation. "Proceed," I said. By late afternoon, the formal request for audit disclosure was drafted and sent. Joseph had 48 hours to secure the buyback. At the same time, the board would begin examining expense trails and valuation adjustments. 2 clocks were ticking. One financial, one reputational. As I locked up the restaurant that night, my phone buzzed again. "We need to fix this before it becomes irreversible." I stared at the message for a long moment. It was already irreversible. He thought I had followed him to that hotel because I was jealous. What he didn't realize was that I had followed him into his own paperwork. And paperwork never lies. 48 hours sounds like a long time until you're the one being timed. The buyback notice was delivered on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Joseph had called me 17 times. I didn't answer. He left 2 voicemails. "You're creating unnecessary instability. This could damage everyone." Everyone? By evening, his tone had shifted. "Call me back. We can talk about this." When he finally stopped calling me and started calling Michael instead, I knew the panic had reached the right level. Joseph didn't have the liquidity. The valuation on paper made him look powerful. But paper power and accessible cash are not the same thing. Michael called me just before dinner service began. "He's asking for an extension," he said. "No," I replied. "He's claiming the valuation calculation is inflated. It's based on their last funding round," I said. "Signed and published." Michael paused for a second. He's scrambling. That word felt accurate. I went back to the kitchen and continued plating entrees like nothing in my life was shifting behind the scenes. Lemon butter sauce. Microgreens. Controlled heat. Controlled motion. My staff noticed I was quieter than usual, but not distracted. I had learned something over the years. Chaos looks loud from the outside. From the inside, it's usually paperwork. By Wednesday morning, the second day of the deadline, Michael forwarded me preliminary findings from the internal audit request. It started with expense reports. Multiple client development trips charged to the corporate card over the past year. Hotel stays. Fine dining. Private transportation. Several of them matched the boutique hotel where I had found him. The classification codes listed them as strategic planning sessions. The approval signatures belonged to Amanda. I stared at the spreadsheet for a long moment. Joseph hadn't just cheated. He had subsidized it. There was more. One reimbursement had occurred during the same week I had been hospitalized briefly for stress-related complications. He had told me he was attending a product summit out of state. He had used the corporate account. Does this qualify? I asked Michael. It qualifies for review, he said carefully. Misuse of corporate funds falls under fiduciary responsibility. If the board determines personal benefit was disguised as business expenditure, that strengthens your position. Strengthens. The word sounded clinical. At noon, as the lunch rush peaked, The front host stepped into the kitchen looking uneasy. "There's a woman here asking for you," she said. I didn't need a description. Joseph's mother stood near the bar when I walked out. Perfect posture. Tight smile. "Emily?" she said softly. "Can we talk?" I led her outside. "You're going too far," she said immediately. "You're humiliating him." "I didn't publish anything," I replied. "You initiated this," she insisted. "The board wouldn't be involved if you hadn't filed that notice." "I exercised my rights," I said calmly. She looked at me as if I had broken an unspoken rule. "You don't have the power you think you do." I almost laughed. "Neither does he," I said. Her expression shifted. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "He built that company from nothing," she said. "With my capital," I replied. Silence settled between us. "He'll lose everything," she whispered. "No," I said evenly. "He's losing control." She studied my face, searching for anger. She didn't find any. "What do you want?" she finally asked. "Balance." But I didn't say it out loud. "I want accountability," I said instead. She left without another word. By late afternoon, Michael called again. "The board has scheduled an emergency audit committee review," he said. "Investor pressure is mounting. They're concerned about compliance exposure before the next funding milestone." Joseph had been the face of stability in every investor presentation. Now he was the variable. "And the buyback?" I asked. "He hasn't secured the funds," Michael said. "He tried leveraging personal assets. But they're tied up." Of course they were. The house wasn't his. The car wasn't his. And the majority of his net worth existed in equity that fluctuated with reputation. "Once the 48-hour window closes," Michael continued, "you can open discussions with external buyers," which meant introducing new shareholders, new influence, new votes. Joseph had always guarded board composition carefully. Now that control was slipping. My phone buzzed again. "Joseph." I answered this time. "You're blowing this up," he said, voice tight. "Investors are nervous." "Then you should reassure them," I said. "By selling my company to outsiders." "You signed the clause," I reminded him. He was silent for several seconds. "I can transfer property," he said finally. "Increase the settlement. Just stop this. Stop." He still thought I was the one pulling emotional strings. "This isn't about stopping," I said quietly. "It's about compliance." "You're enjoying this," he accused. "No," I said honestly. "I'm documenting it." The 48-hour deadline expired at 9:12 the next morning. Michael sent the confirmation email. Buyback period lapsed. External transfer rights activated. Joseph called again. I didn't answer. By noon, word spread internally at his company that the audit committee was expanding its review to include executive expense authorization. He texted one last message that day. "We can still fix this before it destroys everything." I looked around my restaurant. Full tables, focused staff, controlled heat. Nothing here was being destroyed. He thought the clock had been ticking on our marriage. He didn't realize it had been ticking on his control. The email arrived at 6:32 in the morning. Subject line: Internal audit review initiated. I was alone in the restaurant, tying my apron before the breakfast prep began. The dining room was quiet. Chairs still upside down on tables. Sunlight creeping through the front windows. I opened the message slowly. The board had formally engaged an independent forensic accounting firm. Scope: executive expense authorization, travel reimbursements, and valuation reporting integrity. I read the sentence twice. This was no longer a marital disagreement. It was governance. Michael called minutes later. "They moved faster than expected," he said. "Investor pressure accelerated the timeline." "Because of the funding round?" I asked. "Yes. They can't risk reputational exposure before closing." Reputational exposure. Joseph had always emphasized optics. Clean slides. Clean narratives. Clean growth curves. Now his own records were being examined under fluorescent light. By 9 in the morning, I learned he had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending audit findings. Not fired. Not yet. But removed from unilateral authority. He no longer has independent approval power, Michael explained. Any expense authorization or financial modification requires interim oversight. Joseph had once controlled every internal decision with quiet precision. Now his access required permission. I imagined him sitting in his office, watching control evaporate in real time. Later that afternoon, Michael forwarded excerpts from the initial forensic review. Patterns, not isolated errors. Repeated travel reimbursements categorized as client development strategy. Multiple luxury hotel stays. Private dining. Transportation charges. One hotel name appeared more than once. The same boutique hotel. The dates aligned with Amanda's travel approvals. She signed off on several of these, Michael said. But executive direction overrides internal accounting protocol, meaning Joseph's instruction mattered more than her approval. There was more. One reimbursement entry stood out. It was filed during a week I had been admitted overnight for severe stress symptoms. He had told me he was at a technology summit. The charge was listed under innovation development. I closed my eyes for a second. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had done it efficiently. Does the board see this? I asked. They will, Michael replied. The forensic team reports directly to the audit committee. By late afternoon, the company issued an internal memo, temporary leadership restructuring pending review. Joseph requested an emergency meeting with the board to clarify context. He framed it as a personal matter being misinterpreted, a marital dispute weaponized. He still believed he could control the narrative. But the board wasn't evaluating marriage. They were evaluating fiduciary duty. That evening, Joseph called me again. This time his voice wasn't irritated. It was strained. "You're not understanding what this does," he said. "This affects employees, families. You charged personal travel to the company," I replied. "It wasn't that simple." "It's never that simple," I said. Silence filled the line. "This is going to escalate beyond divorce," he warned. "It already has," I answered. After I hung up, my phone rang again. His mother. I hesitated before answering. "Emily," she said. Her tone different now. Softer. "This has gone too far." "I didn't start the audit," I said calmly. "You initiated the trigger," she insisted. "I exercised my rights." She exhaled sharply. "He's under review. Investors are calling. This could ruin his career." I thought of the night in the parking lot. The three of them standing beside my car like I was an inconvenience. "I didn't ruin his career," I said quietly. "Documentation did." There was a pause. "What do you want?" she asked again. "Balance. I want accountability," I said. She didn't argue this time. After we hung up, I returned to the kitchen. The rhythm of service steadied me. Orders called out, pans sizzling, timers ticking. Michael texted later that night. Misconduct clause likely to activate. Threshold met. My preferred equity included acceleration rights in the event of material reputational harm or executive misconduct. The forensic review had established a pattern, not a mistake. A pattern. Once activated, Michael wrote, "You gain temporary expanded voting influence until governance stabilizes. Structural authority, not emotional leverage." Joseph sent one more message just before midnight. "Let's fix this before it destroys everything." I stared at the screen. He still saw destruction. I saw correction. By the next morning, financial news outlets picked up a short industry note. Senior executive placed on administrative leave amid internal audit. No names yet. But inside his company, everyone knew. For the first time since that hotel parking lot, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Alignment. The night I found him leaning against my car, I felt humiliated. Now the system he trusted more than he trusted me was measuring him. And systems, unlike emotions, Don't flinch. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the morning. I didn't attend in person. I didn't need to. As a preferred shareholder with accelerated voting rights triggered by the misconduct clause, I was granted remote access. Michael sat beside me in his office. His laptop connected to the secure stream. The screen showed a conference table in a glass-walled room. Faces arranged in controlled tension. Joseph sat at the far end. He looked composed. But there was a rigidity to his posture I had never seen before. The interim chair opened the meeting. This session concerns findings from the independent forensic audit, she began. The accounting firm representative presented the summary. Repeated executive-level expense authorizations classified as business development that aligned with personal travel patterns. Reimbursement structures bypassing secondary oversight controls. Internal valuation adjustments minimizing early capital contribution weight in investor-facing summaries. I watched Joseph's jaw tighten. These charges were strategic networking, he said when given the floor. Client cultivation is rarely cleanly categorized. The forensic auditor responded calmly. The destinations and accompanying personnel appear consistent with personal association rather than client engagement. Accompanying personnel. Amanda was not present in the room. She had already submitted a written statement claiming procedural reliance on executive directive. Translation. She approved what Joseph told her to approve. Joseph shifted tactics. My personal circumstances are being weaponized, he said. This is a divorce dispute. The interim chair did not blink. The review concerns fiduciary duty, she replied. Fiduciary. The word landed heavier in a boardroom than it ever did in our kitchen. Michael muted our microphone. He's framing it as personal retaliation, he whispered. He always does, I said quietly. The auditor continued. Additionally, we identified discrepancies in internal valuation memos circulated prior to the last funding round. Early-stage equity injections were proportionally understated. A board member leaned forward. Were those changes approved by shareholder consent? No documented amendment, the auditor replied. Joseph looked directly into the camera feed. For a second, our eyes met through the screen. He knew I was watching. Those adjustments reflected performance weighting, he said tightly. There was no intent to mislead. Intent is difficult to prove. Documentation is not. The chair cleared her throat. Given the pattern identified, the committee recommends formal suspension pending final review and temporary reallocation of executive authority. Suspension. Not leave. Suspension. The word hung in the air. Joseph's voice lost its smooth cadence. This will destabilize investor confidence, he warned. Investor confidence is destabilized by exposure. The chair replied, There was a vote. It wasn't unanimous, but it passed. Joseph Miller was formally suspended from executive control pending full compliance resolution. Michael exhaled quietly beside me. Your clause triggered precisely as structured, he said. On screen. Joseph sat very still. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't arguing. He was calculating. The meeting ended within 40 minutes. I closed the laptop slowly. For a long moment, neither Michael nor I spoke. This is where it shifts, he finally said. From internal review to external narrative? Will it go public? I asked. Eventually, investors won't sit on uncertainty. By mid-afternoon, an internal memo circulated through the company confirming leadership restructuring. By evening, a trade publication ran a short piece. Senior executive suspended amid audit findings. The article didn't mention me. It didn't mention divorce. It didn't mention Amanda. It mentioned governance review, reputational risk, shareholder oversight. Joseph called that night. I let it ring once, then twice. Then I answered. What do you want? He asked. His voice was no longer sharp. It was strained. You know what I want, I said. You've humiliated me publicly. You humiliated yourself privately, I replied. He was silent. This didn't have to happen, he said after a moment. It did, I answered. He tried one last pivot. You think this makes you powerful? I thought about the parking lot. About his mother sitting in the back seat of my car like I was the outsider. About the way he had said we weren't in the same league. I think it makes things balanced, I said. He didn't respond. We ended the call without resolution. The next morning, Michael forwarded updated financial projections. With Joseph suspended, interim leadership was stabilizing investor communications. Funding negotiations were paused but not terminated. My equity remained intact. My voting power temporarily elevated. You can now initiate transfer discussions if you choose, Michael said. Introduce a strategic buyer. Would that accelerate governance change? I asked. Yes. It would dilute his eventual reinstatement leverage. Joseph had always guarded board composition carefully. Now he had no vote, no access, no narrative control. That afternoon, I received an email from an investment firm that had previously expressed interest in minority acquisition. They had heard about the governance shift. They wanted to talk. I stared at the message for a long moment. Joseph believed the night I found him at the hotel was the climax. It wasn't. That was exposure. This was consequence. When I locked the restaurant that night, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not satisfaction. Stability. He had once told me that power belonged to the person who earned the most. Now he understood something different. Power belonged to the person who documented the terms. The first time I sat across from the investment firm, I wore a white blazer instead of my chef's jacket. It wasn't about appearance. It was about translation. The restaurant smelled like roasted garlic and citrus reduction. The conference room in their downtown office smelled like polished wood and filtered air. Different worlds. Same leverage. There were 3 of them at the table. Managing partner, legal counsel, senior analyst. They already knew about the audit. They already knew about Joseph's suspension. They already knew I held preferred equity with temporary accelerated voting rights. What they wanted to know was simple. Was I willing to sell? I'm not interested in destabilizing the company, I said calmly. I'm interested in stabilizing governance. The managing partner nodded. A minority acquisition under your terms could introduce oversight without full control transfer, he said. It would also prevent unilateral reinstatement. Joseph had built his leadership on loyalty alignment. If I transferred even a portion of my equity to an external strategic investor, the board composition would shift permanently. Valuation, I asked. They slid a preliminary proposal across the table, slightly above last funding round price. They weren't buying panic. They were buying influence. I didn't answer immediately. I'll review, I said. That night, Joseph called again. This time he didn't sound angry. He sounded exhausted. They're talking to outside investors, he said. Yes, I replied. You're going to hand them my company. Your company? I asked softly. Silence. I built that infrastructure, he said finally. With my capital? I reminded him. He exhaled slowly. They'll push me out permanently. They'll push for compliance. I corrected. You're enjoying this, he said again. But there was no conviction behind it. I'm protecting what's mine, I replied. The next morning, news spread internally that Amanda had submitted her resignation. Official statement. Pursuing new opportunities. Unofficial reality. Distancing from executive misconduct exposure. Michael called shortly after. Her exit reduces liability chain complexity, he said. But the audit findings remain. What's the board leaning toward? I asked. Conditional reinstatement unlikely. Structural governance reform almost certain. Joseph's world had been built on perception of control. Now perception was recalibrating. Later that afternoon, his mother showed up again. This time she didn't stand tall. She sat. I didn't understand the contracts, she said quietly. I did, I replied. She nodded slowly. He thought income meant authority, she admitted. He said that often, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. I underestimated you, she said. There it was. Not an apology. An admission. I didn't need you to overestimate me, I answered. I needed him to respect agreements. She didn't argue. When she left, something inside me felt lighter. Not because she conceded, but because I no longer needed her to. 2 days later, the forensic audit report was finalized. Material executive misconduct confirmed. Improper expense authorization. Valuation reporting irregularities. Governance failure. The board issued a formal announcement. Joseph Miller would not return to executive leadership. An interim CEO would remain in place while the company restructured compliance systems. Michael forwarded the press release. No mention of my name. No mention of the hotel. Just governance reform and strategic oversight. Joseph texted me that evening. They're removing me permanently. I didn't respond immediately. Then another message. We can still settle this privately. Private. He still thought privacy protected him. You signed the clause. I finally wrote back. Minutes passed before his reply came. You never told me you'd use it. I stared at the screen. I never told you I wouldn't. He didn't respond after that. The following week, I met again with the investment firm. We structured a partial transfer. Not all of my equity. Enough to introduce an independent board seat aligned with governance reform. Enough to ensure Joseph could never quietly reclaim control. The transfer documents were signed under clean legal terms. No theatrics. No revenge speech. Just signatures. When the announcement became public, financial press framed it as strategic restructuring following executive misconduct. Joseph's name appeared once. Removed from leadership. Transitioning out of operational role. Amanda's resignation was a footnote. By the time the dust settled, the company was stable again. Valuation adjusted slightly downward. Investors reassured. Governance reinforced. And Joseph no longer at the center. He sent one final message that week. You didn't have to destroy me. I read it twice. I hadn't destroyed him. Documentation had the same documentation he once dismissed as minor detail. That night, I walked through my restaurant after closing. The floors were clean. The lights dimmed. The kitchen quiet. The Tesla sat in the parking lot outside. My name on the title. My capital in the structure. My equity in the system. Joseph had believed power came from earning $1 million a year. He never understood that power came from understanding the terms. And the terms had always been mine. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in early fall. The courthouse in downtown Phoenix was quieter than I expected. No dramatic crowd. No reporters. Just beige walls, fluorescent lights, and people waiting for their lives to be divided into percentages. I wore the same white blazer I had worn to meet the investors. Not as armor. As consistency. Joseph stood near the far wall when I walked in. He looked thinner. Not fragile. Just recalibrated. We didn't greet each other. Michael sat beside me. Documents neatly arranged. Financial disclosures. Property records. Trust documentation. Equity summaries. Joseph's attorney glanced through the stack with visible discomfort. The judge entered. We stood. We sat. Proceedings began with asset clarification. Primary residence. Purchased with inheritance funds from my grandmother's estate trust. Title solely in my name. Joseph's counsel attempted to argue marital contribution through maintenance and property appreciation. Michael responded calmly. Premarital acquisition with no joint title amendment, he said. Primary equity traceable to non-community property. The judge nodded and made a note. Next. The Tesla Model X. Registered solely in my name. Purchased with inherited funds. No co-signature. Joseph's attorney didn't challenge this one. Investment accounts were more complex. Marital income contributions required division under state law. Joseph's stock-based compensation accumulated during the marriage. Deferred bonus structures. Retirement accounts. Line by line. The financial landscape was mapped. I listened without flinching. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about recalculating truth. Then came the equity discussion. 15% preferred shares. Partially transferred to a strategic investor. Remaining equity held through my LLC. Joseph's attorney attempted to frame the buyback trigger and subsequent transfer as retaliatory action. Michael leaned forward slightly. The equity structure predates marital conflict, he said. Contractual enforcement occurred following documented executive misconduct confirmed by independent audit. The word misconduct settled into the courtroom air. Joseph's jaw tightened. The judge reviewed the audit summary submitted as evidence. Improper expense authorization. Governance violations. Temporary suspension. Permanent removal from executive leadership. This was not character testimony. This was documentation. Then the judge asked if there were any additional statements before financial distribution rulings were finalized. Michael glanced at me. I hadn't planned to speak. But something in the sterile quiet of that room shifted. Yes. Your Honor, I said. Joseph looked up at me for the first time that morning. 6 months earlier, I had discovered the affair. 3 months before the hotel parking lot, I had discovered something else. I became pregnant earlier this year, I said evenly. Joseph's expression changed instantly. I did not inform him. I continued. I believed stability was possible at the time. The courtroom remained silent. I experienced a stress-related medical complication, I said carefully. The pregnancy did not continue. Joseph's face lost color. You never told me, he whispered. The judge's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. Is this relevant to financial consideration? She asked. Yes, Michael answered gently. It reflects emotional and medical impact during the period of documented misconduct. Joseph stared at me like he was trying to reconstruct a version of reality he had missed. When? He asked quietly. The week you submitted reimbursement for the Scottsdale Innovation Retreat. And I said. His breath caught. He understood immediately. The hotel charge. The fabricated summit. The night I had waited alone in an emergency room. The judge reviewed the medical documentation provided. There was no dramatics. No raised voices. Just recognition. I will factor this into equitable consideration, she said. Final rulings were issued that afternoon. The house remained mine. The vehicle remained mine. Marital investment accounts were divided proportionally. I received structured financial compensation reflecting documented misconduct impact. The total valuation of my awarded assets and equity positions exceeded $15 million. Joseph received his remaining equity stake, minus dilution from strategic transfer. He would retain wealth. He would not retain control. When the session ended, people filed out quietly. Joseph approached me near the exit. You should have told me, he said. I tried to, I replied. He looked confused. I waited for you to notice I wasn't sleeping, I said. I waited for you to ask why I stopped cooking dinner. He had no response. I thought you were just distant, he said. I was exhausted. I answered. There was nothing left to explain. No anger. No tears. Just distance. Outside the courthouse. The air felt lighter than I expected. Not because I had won, but because I had closed. Joseph stood on the steps behind me, phone already in his hand. Likely calling someone about next moves? He would rebuild. He always did. But this time he would rebuild without presuming ownership of what wasn't his. I walked to the Tesla parked along the curb. My name on the title. My capital in the structure. My terms enforced. Joseph once believed his $1 million salary defined power. He never understood that power is quiet until it is documented. And once documented, it doesn't argue, it concludes. The morning after the divorce decree was finalized, I unlocked the restaurant before sunrise. The air inside still carried the faint scent of rosemary from the night before. Stainless steel counters reflected the dim overhead lights. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening to the quiet. For years, I had measured my days in orders and invoices, in prep lists and reservations. Now I was measuring something else. Capacity. The settlement funds were already being transferred in stages. Liquid assets. Structured payouts. Equity distributions. The numbers on paper looked unreal, but they didn't feel surreal. They felt earned. Michael and I met later that week to review long-term allocation. You could diversify into passive holdings, he said. Reduce exposure. Secure generational wealth. I will, I replied. But not all of it. He waited. I want to expand, I said. Not just the restaurant. The idea had been forming quietly for months. Even before the audit began. I had watched women come into my kitchen over the years, single mothers, widows, women restarting after divorce. They weren't unskilled. They were unseen. Joseph once told me cooking wasn't scale. He was wrong. Skill scales when structure supports it. Within 3 weeks, I signed the lease on a second location. Not another restaurant. A training kitchen. A space designed specifically for women who wanted to build culinary businesses but didn't have capital or mentorship. We named it the Carter Kitchen Collective, after my grandmother, the woman whose inheritance Joseph once considered small background money. I converted part of my equity payout into a revolving micro-investment fund for graduates. Structured, documented, accountable, not charity, infrastructure. The first orientation session filled within days. One of the women, 58, had spent 30 years catering church events without ever formalizing a business. My husband always handled the contracts, she said quietly during introductions. After he left, I didn't know where to start. I smiled gently. We'll start with documentation, I said. Documentation. The word no longer tasted bitter. It tasted solid. News about Joseph faded from industry headlines after the initial restructuring announcement. He was officially transitioned into a non-operational advisory role before quietly exiting entirely. Amanda's name disappeared from the company website within a month. No scandal press. No dramatic downfall. Just removal. Joseph sent one more email about 6 months after the court ruling. Subject: closure. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. He wrote about regret, not just for the affair, for arrogance, for assuming income equaled authority, for mistaking independence for insignificance. I underestimated you, he wrote. I didn't respond, not because I hated him, but because I didn't need him to understand anymore. Understanding was no longer currency. The second location opened in early spring. The night before the launch, I walked through the new training kitchen alone. Rows of clean prep stations, fresh equipment, bright overhead lights. The Tesla was parked outside. Still mine. It no longer symbolized humiliation. It symbolized leverage. I ran my hand along one of the stainless steel counters and thought about the hotel parking lot. About how small I had felt standing there. About how loud my humiliation had been in my own head. That moment had felt like the collapse of everything. It was exposure. Exposure of truth. Exposure of imbalance. Exposure of contracts that protected me even when I felt unprotected. Opening day arrived with a quiet hum of energy. Women stood at their stations in crisp aprons. Nervous but determined. Cameras were there. But not for scandal. For coverage of a new business initiative focused on female entrepreneurship. A reporter asked me during the ribbon-cutting ceremony what inspired the expansion. I paused for a second. Understanding value, I said simply. She nodded, expecting more. I didn't elaborate. Some stories don't need retelling. That evening, after the celebration ended and the guests left, I drove home slowly. The house felt different now. Not because Joseph's things were gone, but because the silence was mine. I walked through the living room, past the framed degrees on the wall. Mine. For years, I believed our achievements were joint identity. Now I understood something else. Partnership only works when both parties respect structure. Joseph once told me we weren't in the same league. He measured leagues in salary. I measured leagues in ownership. The restaurant continued to thrive. The training kitchen filled new cohorts. The micro-investment fund funded its first 3 graduates within 6 months. Their businesses launched. Documented. Structured. Protected. One evening, as I locked up the second location, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't look triumphant. I looked steady. Joseph had once earned $1 million a year. I once earned a few thousand a month. He believed that defined hierarchy. What he never understood was this. Money measures income. Contracts measure power. And power, when structured correctly, doesn't need to shout. It builds. 6 months after the second location opened, I stopped checking Joseph's name in financial news alerts. For a while, I had tracked it out of habit. Not obsession. Just awareness. Industry restructuring updates. Leadership transitions. Small notes buried in quarterly reports. Then one day I realized I hadn't searched in weeks. The Carter Kitchen Collective had outgrown its initial projection. Our second cohort was double the size of the first. Applications were coming in from women across Arizona and neighboring states. Some drove 2 hours twice a week just to attend workshops on licensing, cost analysis, and contract negotiation. We didn't just teach recipes. We taught paperwork. One afternoon, a woman named Diane stayed after class. She was 55, recently divorced, and had been baking from home for years. My ex used to handle all the numbers, she said, holding a folder of drafted business plans. He told me I wouldn't understand the structure. I looked at her and felt something familiar settle in my chest. You don't have to understand everything, I said gently. You just have to understand what you're signing. She nodded slowly. It was never about mastering every detail. It was about refusing to ignore the ones that mattered. The micro-investment fund issued its 5th loan that month. Structured agreements, clear repayment schedules, equity options if growth accelerated. Each contract was explained line by line. No one signed blindly. Not here. The restaurant itself had also evolved. We expanded private dining bookings and launched a seasonal tasting series that sold out weeks in advance. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building forward rather than reacting. There were still moments of quiet reflection. Late at night, when the kitchen lights were off and the city outside had softened into distant hum, I sometimes thought about the parking lot again. The shock, the sting, the humiliation. It felt distant now, not erased, just contextualized. Humiliation is loud in the moment. Authority is quiet over time. Joseph sent one more email a year after the divorce. This one was shorter. I'm stepping away from the industry for a while. He wrote, I needed distance to understand what I confused with power. I read it once and archived it. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vindication. I felt separation. We were no longer orbiting the same structure. His mother never contacted me again. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had quietly sold her townhouse and moved closer to extended family. No confrontation. No reconciliation. Just distance. And distance can be its own kind of peace. The investment firm that acquired partial equity remained active on the board. Pushing governance reform and transparency, the company stabilized under new leadership. It wasn't spectacular growth, but it was steady. Steady is underrated. I gradually sold a small additional portion of my remaining shares once valuation recovered. Not because I needed the money, but because I no longer needed influence there. Influence belongs where intention aligns. One evening, as construction wrapped on a small event space attached to the collective, I stood inside the unfinished room with my project manager. What do you want this space to feel like? She asked. Ownership, I said. She laughed lightly. That's abstract. Not really, I replied. Ownership feels calm. She studied me for a second and nodded. Calm. That was the difference. A year earlier, I had stood in a courthouse calculating percentages. 2 years earlier, I had stood in a parking lot calculating betrayal. Now I stood in a space I built from capital I protected. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just grounded. On the anniversary of the hotel night, I didn't market. I didn't post anything. I didn't revisit the location. I taught a contract literacy workshop instead. 23 women around stainless steel tables, highlighting clauses in sample agreements. This line matters, I said, pointing to a paragraph. If there's misconduct, Here's what triggers. They leaned in. They asked questions. They read every word. As the session ended, one of them asked quietly, "How did you learn this?" I paused. "Experience," I said simply. When I drove home that evening, the Tesla hummed quietly along the highway. The sunset stretched across the desert in soft gold. The car no longer felt symbolic. It felt ordinary. And that was the transformation. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It wasn't about destroying his career. It wasn't about making him feel what I felt. It was about understanding value before someone else tried to define it for me. Joseph once told me we weren't in the same league. He was right. We weren't, not because he earned more, but because I learned to read the structure. He built products. I built protection. He chased valuation. I secured ownership. The world didn't need to know the full story. The boardroom didn't need to know the parking lot. The press didn't need to know the emergency room. I knew, and that was enough. For the first time in years, my life felt quiet. Not small. Not diminished. Expanded. He thought leaving me would shrink my world. It was the first step that made it larger. The day we officially opened the event space at the Carter Kitchen Collective, I arrived before anyone else. The room smelled like fresh paint and polished wood. Long stainless steel tables stood in perfect alignment under warm pendant lights. At the far wall, my grandmother's framed recipe card hung beside a simple brass plaque. Ownership is built, not assumed. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the nearest counter. 2 years ago, I stood in a parking lot staring at my husband leaning against my car with another woman. 2 years ago, I thought I had lost everything. I didn't lose everything. I lost illusion. There's a difference. Guests began arriving mid-morning, local entrepreneurs, community leaders, former students who now ran their own catering companies and bakeries. The room filled with conversation and the clatter of trays being set down. I moved between them easily, not as someone proving a point, but as someone hosting a space she built. Diane, the 55-year-old baker from our first cohort, pulled me aside near the coffee station. "My second location opens next month," she said, smiling in disbelief. I read every clause this time. I smiled back. "That's the point," I said. Across the room, I noticed a young woman explaining repayment schedules to another student using the same templates we had developed. Clear terms. Transparent language. No hidden clauses. The infrastructure was replicating itself. That was power. Not loud. Not performative. Sustainable. Later that afternoon, after the speeches ended and the crowd thinned, I stepped outside alone. The Tesla sat parked near the curb, sunlight reflecting off the windshield. For a long time, that car represented humiliation. It was the place I learned what Joseph was capable of. It was the place I realized how easily someone can mistake access for ownership. Now it represented something else. Proof. Proof that ownership is not about who drives. It's about whose name is on the title. I thought about the words Joseph once said. "You're not in the same league." At the time, they cut deeper than I admitted. Not because I believed him, but because part of me wondered if income really did define worth. It doesn't. Income fluctuates. Contracts endure. Titles matter. Structure matters. Documentation matters. If I've learned anything, it's this. Humiliation feels like the end. It isn't. It's information. Information about imbalance. Information about misplaced trust. Information about who underestimated you. What you do with that information defines the rest of the story. Joseph once believed his $1 million salary gave him leverage. He never considered that leverage can be quiet. That leverage can sit in a folder. That leverage can wait patiently until someone activates it. I didn't destroy him. I enforced terms. I didn't seek revenge. I sought balance. And balance doesn't require rage. It requires clarity. When I walked back inside the collective, the room had nearly emptied. Staff were stacking chairs and wiping down surfaces. I paused at the center of the room and let the silence settle around me. 2 years ago, I would have thought this silence meant loneliness. Now it felt like ownership. There will always be people who measure value by paycheck. There will always be people who confuse visibility with power. But the real power often belongs to the person who reads what others skim, the person who protects what others dismiss, the person who stays calm when someone else expects collapse. If you're watching this and you've ever been told you were less than because you earned less, or because your work looked smaller, remember this: scale is not the same as value. And value is not determined by the loudest voice in the room. It's determined by the terms you agree to and the ones you refuse. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, or if you've learned the hard way that documentation can save you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Tell me what moment changed your understanding of power. And if you want more stories about quiet leverage, strategic balance, and women who reclaim control without losing themselves, stay here with us. Subscribe, follow, and keep building. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's expansion. And sometimes the person who seems the least powerful is the one who understands the game best. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.